Michael, a Marine, stops at Ember Field rest stop. In the diner, he spots 8-year-old black Zoe with white Greg. Zoe's nervous, making distressed gestures. Greg's behavior is suspicious. Michael suspects danger. As the situation escalates, will Michael save Zoe? What dark secrets will be uncovered about Greg's plan? Hey everyone, welcome to Worldly Whispers. Let's get started. Michael Winston, a battle-hardened Marine, was on a long drive when he pulled into the Ember Field rest stop. It was a quiet place, with a diner and a convenience store, offering a brief respite from the monotony of the highway. He entered the diner, his eyes scanning the room out of habit, a behavior ingrained by his military training. Near the window, he noticed a young black girl seated in a yellow booth. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She wore a bright red dress that contrasted sharply with her dark skin, and her curly hair framed a face that seemed preoccupied. Across from her sat an older white man in his early 50s. He had neatly combed salt and pepper hair and was dressed in a crisp navy blue suit. The girl's demeanor immediately caught Michael's attention. Her eyes were wide and darted nervously around the room, never resting on one thing for long. Her small hands fidgeted in her lap, and every so often, she would raise them to her face, as if trying to shield herself from something. The man, on the other hand, held his newspaper up, creating a partial barrier between himself and the girl. But Michael observed that the man's eyes would periodically peer over the top of the paper, watching the child with an intensity that seemed out of place. As Michael made his way to the counter to order a coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The age and race difference between the two could have an innocent explanation. Perhaps the girl was adopted, or the man was a family friend. However, the girl's apparent discomfort and the man's overly controlled behavior nagged at him. He tried to push aside his unease, telling himself he was there for a quick break before continuing his journey. But as he waited for his coffee, his gaze kept returning to the pair by the window. The girl's eyes briefly met his, and in that fleeting moment, Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. There was a depth of emotion in her young eyes that went beyond simple shyness or fatigue. To get a better view without drawing attention, Michael positioned himself near the vending machines. Leaning against the wall, he sipped his coffee slowly, his mind wrestling with the scene before him. The girl's fingers drummed a silent rhythm on the tabletop, and her feet swung beneath her seat, unable to reach the floor. Every now and then, she would glance up at the man, quickly averting her gaze when she found him watching her. The man maintained an air of calm detachment, his eyes moving between his newspaper and the child with practiced nonchalance. Michael's military training had sharpened his instincts, teaching him to trust his gut when something didn't feel right. And right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that this situation warranted closer observation. He was caught between the desire to intervene and the fear of overreacting. He couldn't help but wonder about the story behind this strange tableau. Who were these people? What had brought them to this quiet rest stop on a lonely stretch of highway? And most importantly, was the girl truly safe? As the minutes ticked by, Michael found himself unable to leave. The growing sense of unease in his chest had taken root, and he knew he couldn't go until he was certain that his concerns were unfounded. So he settled in for a longer stay, his coffee cooling in his hand as he kept a watchful eye on the curious pair by the window. The quiet hum of conversation in the diner provided a backdrop to Michael's thoughts as he continued his vigilant observation. He had long since finished his coffee but lingered, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes were constantly drawn back to the girl in the red dress and the man in the navy suit. Then, he noticed the girl make an odd hand gesture. She raised her hand slightly, palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it immediately caught Michael's attention. He furrowed his brow, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a nervous tic, a habit born of boredom, or something more? The girl's eyes darted around the room nervously before briefly meeting Michael's gaze. In that fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in her expression, fear, desperation. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it left Michael with an even stronger sense of unease. His military training kicked in, and his mind raced through possibilities. The hand gesture nagged at him. It seemed intentional, deliberate. Could it be a distress signal? He had seen similar gestures used in high-stress situations, a silent plea for help when words were too dangerous to speak. Michael's pulse quickened as he considered the implications. If the girl was indeed trying to signal for help, what exactly was she afraid of? The man across from her seemed calm and composed, his attention apparently focused on his newspaper. But there was something about the way he watched the girl, his gaze too controlled, too intent, that set Michael's nerves on edge. He He tried to rationalize the situation. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a quiet diner at a rest stop. The girl could simply be shy, uncomfortable around strangers. The man could be a family friend or even a relative, despite their different races. Despite his attempts to convince himself otherwise, Michael's instincts, honed by years of military service, were screaming at him that something was wrong. The tension in his body grew as he continued to observe. He noticed how the girl seemed to shrink into herself whenever the man's gaze fell upon her. Her movements were stiff and controlled, as if she were trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. It was a far cry from the natural exuberance one would expect from a child her age. The man, for his part, maintained his facade of normalcy. He sipped his coffee, turned the pages of his newspaper, and occasionally made what appeared to be casual conversation with the girl. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was all an act, a carefully constructed veneer of normalcy hiding something far more sinister. As the minutes ticked by, Michael found himself caught in an internal struggle. Should he approach them, ask if everything was all right? But what if he was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding, and he ended up causing unnecessary distress? The weight of the decision pressed down on him. His military training urged him to act, while his civilian sensibilities cautioned restraint. He decided to wait, to watch a little longer. If the girl made the hand signal again, if he saw any clear signs of distress, then he would intervene. Until then, he would remain vigilant, ready to act at a moment's notice. As he stood there, poised on the knife's edge between action and inaction, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life could take. Just days ago, he had been in a war zone, facing clear and present dangers. Now back on American soil, he found himself embroiled in a different kind of conflict, one where the lines between right and wrong, action and overreaction, were frustratingly blurred. Michael continued his watch over the strange pair. The girl, Zoe, seemed to be in a constant state of distress. Her eyes, which were initially just nervous, now held a look of pure fear. Each time the man, Greg, glanced at her, she would involuntarily flinch, her small body tensing up as if expecting a blow. Greg maintained his composed demeanor, but Michael noticed the subtle signs that betrayed his true nature. His eyes, when they rested on Zoe, held a possessive and controlling glint. He would occasionally lean in, murmuring something in a low voice that Michael couldn't catch. But the effect on Zoe was immediate and profound. Her shoulders would hunch, and she would shrink even further into herself, as if trying to disappear. Despite his growing certainty that something was seriously wrong, Michael still struggled with self-doubt. He kept telling himself that he might be overreacting, that he was reading way too much into a simple interaction between a man and a girl in a diner. After all, he was back in civilian life, and his military-trained eyes might be seeing threats where none existed. However, the more he watched, the harder it became to dismiss his concerns. Zoe's body language was screaming for help. Her hands, which had earlier been fidgeting nervously, now seemed to be moving in a more deliberate manner. And then, she made the hand gesture again. This time, there was no room for misinterpretation. Her palm was outstretched, fingers spread wide, and her eyes, filled with a deep sense of desperation, locked onto Michael's for a brief moment. In that split-second connection, Michael felt a jolt of realization. This was a clear distress signal. His heart pounded in his chest as he considered the implications. What kind of danger was Zoe in? And what could he do to help her? He knew he had to act, but he also knew that he had to be careful. One wrong move could put Zoe in even more danger. Michael decided to bide his time a little longer. He needed more evidence, more signs that would confirm his suspicions beyond a shadow of a doubt. He moved slightly, trying to get a better vantage point without drawing attention to himself. As he did so, he noticed that Greg seemed to be growing more impatient. He kept checking his watch and looking around the diner, as if he was waiting for something or someone. Michael's mind was racing. He thought about approaching the table directly and confronting Greg, but he quickly dismissed the idea. Greg was clearly a dangerous man, and any sudden move could cause him to panic and harm Zoe. He needed a more subtle approach. He decided to go to the counter and order some food. This would give him an excuse to stay in the diner for a longer time, and also allow him to get closer to Zoe and Greg without arousing suspicion. As he walked towards the counter, he stole a few more glances at the pair. Zoe's eyes followed him, and for a moment he thought he saw a glimmer of hope in them, as if she knew that he was her only chance of escape. At the counter, Michael ordered a sandwich and some snacks, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. While he waited for his order, he couldn't help but keep an eye on Zoe and Greg. The situation seemed to be escalating. Greg was now speaking to Zoe in a more forceful tone, and she looked on the verge of tears. Finally, Michael's order was ready. He picked up his food and made his way towards the exit, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the pair. As he reached the door, he hesitated. He knew that if he walked out now, he might never get another chance to help Zoe. He turned around for one last look, and in that moment, Zoe made the hand gesture yet again. This time, her eyes were wide with terror, and her whole body was shaking. That was all the confirmation Michael needed. His doubts vanished in an instant, replaced by a steely determination. He couldn't leave Zoe behind. He had to do something, no matter the risk. He put down his food and turned back towards the diner, his mind made up. He was going to confront Greg and get Zoe to safety, one way or another. As he walked back towards the table, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His military training kicked in, and he focused on the task at hand. He had to be calm, composed, and most importantly, ready for anything. Greg looked up as he approached, a look of surprise crossing his face. But he quickly regained his composure, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. Michael stopped a few feet away from the table, his eyes fixed on Greg. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. His gaze then shifted to Zoe, and he gave her a reassuring look, trying to let her know that he was there to help. Zoe's eyes darted between Michael and Greg, and for a moment, she seemed frozen with fear. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Yes." But Michael could see the fear in her eyes and the way her body was trembling. He knew that she was lying, that she was too scared to tell the truth with Greg watching her. Michael nodded slightly, as if he was satisfied with her answer. But inside, he was seething. He knew that he had to play this carefully. He couldn't let Greg know that he suspected anything. He turned and walked a few steps away, as if he was about to leave the diner. But in reality, he was just biding his time, waiting for the right moment to act. As he walked, he could feel Greg's eyes on his back. He knew that Greg was probably relieved that he was leaving, thinking that he had avoided any trouble. But Michael wasn't going to give up that easily. He was determined to save Zoe, and he was willing to do whatever it took. With his mind resolutely made up, Michael turned back into the diner. His steps were purposeful as he walked towards the table where Zoe and Greg sat. The air in the diner seemed to thicken with tension as he approached. Greg, who had been engrossed in his false pretense of normalcy, was visibly startled by Michael's sudden return. His eyes widened for a brief moment, and a flicker of unease crossed his face, but he quickly tried to mask it with a polite smile. Michael stopped a short distance from the table, his stance confident yet non-threatening. His gaze swept between Greg and Zoe, trying to gauge their reactions. Zoe, on the other hand, looked up at him with a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. Her small body trembled slightly, and it was clear that she was in a state of extreme distress. "Is everything okay here?" Michael asked again, this time with a more insistent tone. His eyes were fixed on Zoe, trying to convey a sense of reassurance. Greg was quick to respond, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge of nervousness. "Yes, everything's just fine. We're just having a little break on our journey." "Why do you ask, soldier?" he said, attempting to sound casual while subtly trying to assert his authority. Michael, however, was not deterred. He crouched down slightly to be at Zoe's eye level and asked gently, "Are you sure, honey? You can tell me if something's wrong." Zoe hesitated, her eyes darting between Michael and Greg. Greg's eyes bore into Zoe, a silent warning. After a moment of internal struggle, Zoe reluctantly nodded, her voice barely audible as she said, "Yes." But Michael noticed the hesitation and the fear in her voice, which only strengthened his determination that something was amiss. Pretending to be satisfied with her answer, Michael stood up and took a few steps back. He knew that he couldn't just confront Greg directly without a solid plan. He needed to act smartly to ensure Zoe's safety. As he walked towards the exit, he could feel Greg's eyes following him, a sense of relief emanating from the man. But Michael had no intention of leaving. Once outside the diner, Michael made his way to his car. He positioned himself in such a way that he could keep a close eye on the entrance and the window where Zoe and Greg were seated. His military-trained mind was already formulating a plan. He knew that he couldn't handle this situation alone. He needed backup. Without a second thought, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, Michael spoke in a calm but urgent tone. "I'm at the Ember Field rest stop on Highway 27. There's a young black girl, around 8 years old, wearing a red dress. She's with an older white man in a navy suit. I suspect she's in danger. The girl has made what I believe to be distress signals, and her behavior indicates she's being forced or threatened," he explained, providing detailed descriptions of both Zoe and Greg. "I'm a former Marine, and I've been trained to recognize such signs. Please send the police as soon as possible, he added, hoping to add credibility to his report. The operator assured him that the police were on their way and advised him to stay safe and avoid direct confrontation if possible. Michael acknowledged the instructions, but was prepared to do whatever it took to protect Zoe if the situation escalated. As he waited, his eyes remained fixed on the diner, not daring to blink for fear of missing any crucial moment. Inside the diner, Greg seemed to be growing more restless. He kept looking around, as if sensing that something was about to go wrong. Zoe, meanwhile, sat quietly, her eyes downcast, her small body tense. Suddenly, Greg stood up, grabbed his jacket, and then roughly took hold of Zoe's arm, pulling her up from her seat. Zoe let out a small whimper, and her eyes filled with tears. Michael's heart skipped a beat at the sight. He was on the verge of rushing back into the diner when he heard the welcome sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over him as 2 police cars pulled into the rest stop parking lot, their lights flashing. Without hesitation, Michael sprinted towards the diner, closely followed by the police officers. As they burst through the doors, the atmosphere in the diner erupted into chaos. The few patrons present looked on in shock. Greg froze in his tracks, his face turning pale as he saw Michael and the police. Zoe, on the other hand, looked up with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The police officers quickly took control of the situation, their voices firm as they ordered Greg to let go of Zoe and step back. Greg, still in a state of panic, stammered, "This is all a misunderstanding. She's my niece. We were just leaving." But his words fell on deaf ears. The police officers exchanged glances, their suspicion of Greg growing by the second. One of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster, and said, "Sir, we need you to come with us for some questions. There have been reports of suspicious behavior." Michael, standing beside the officers, kept his eyes on Zoe. He could see the fear and confusion in her eyes. He wanted to rush to her side and comfort her, but he knew that the police needed to handle the situation professionally. As the officers began to question Greg, Michael waited patiently, ready to provide any information he could to help ensure Zoe's safety and justice for whatever had been happening to her. The diner, which had been a place of quiet routine just moments ago, had now become the center of a high-stakes drama. The outcome of the next few minutes would determine Zoe's fate, and Michael was determined to see this through to the end, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The diner had transformed into a scene of high tension. The few remaining patrons watched in stunned silence as the drama unfolded. The air was thick with anticipation, and all eyes were on Greg, Zoe, and the police officers. One of the officers, his voice firm and authoritative, commanded Greg, "Sir, let go of the girl and step back." Greg, seemingly paralyzed with fear, his grip on Zoe's arm tightening reflexively for a moment. Nobody moved. The only sound was Zoe's soft whimper, which pierced Michael's heart. Finally, Greg's composure broke. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She's my niece. We were just leaving, that's all." His eyes darted nervously between Michael and the officers, searching for a way out, but there was none. Michael watched Greg closely, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of danger to Zoe. The officers began to question Greg, asking for proof of his relationship with the girl. Greg fumbled over his words, unable to provide any concrete evidence. His story became more and more incoherent as the officers pressed him further. Throughout this, Zoe stood rooted to the spot, visibly shaking. Michael took a small step forward, trying to position himself between her and Greg without scaring her. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice gentle and reassuring. Zoe looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. As the officers continued their interrogation, Greg's desperation grew. He kept repeating that it was all a mistake, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicions growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, one of the officers gently approached Zoe. Kneeling down to her level, he asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell us who this man is to you? Are you okay?" Zoe's voice trembled as she finally found the courage to speak. "I need help," she whispered, her small frame shaking. "I'm in danger." Those words seemed to seal Greg's fate. The officers immediately decided to arrest him. "Sir, you're under arrest," one officer declared, moving to handcuff Greg. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg's protests grew louder as the reality of his situation set in. But the officers led him out of the diner firmly, and his cries faded as he was put in the back of a police car. Inside the diner, Zoe was left alone, visibly relieved but still scared. Michael stayed nearby, a steady presence. The officers began to question Zoe gently, and Michael knew that this was just the beginning of a long process to ensure justice. The focus then shifted to Michael. An officer approached him. "Sir, we'll need a statement from you. Can you tell us exactly what you saw that made you suspicious?" Michael, his military training kicking in, gave a concise and detailed account of everything he had observed, from the strange hand gestures to the girl's distress and the man's controlling behavior. After Michael finished, the officer said, "You did the right thing calling us. Too many people would have looked the other way. You may well have saved that little girl's life." As the officers continued their work, Zoe's biological father arrived at the police station. He rushed in, his face a mask of worry and relief. His eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on Zoe. "Zoe!" he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. Zoe's head snapped up, and her eyes widened with recognition and relief. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, leaping from her chair and running towards him. The father dropped to his knees, gathering Zoe into his arms. Tears filled his eyes as he held her tight, whispering reassurances. Michael watched the emotional reunion, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that his decision to trust his instincts and act had made all the difference. The events of the day had been intense, but seeing Zoe safe in her father's arms brought a measure of closure. However, he also knew that there was still a long road ahead for Zoe and her family as they dealt with the aftermath of this terrifying ordeal. At the police station, the investigation into Greg's actions unfolded. As officers dug deeper into his background, they uncovered a series of shocking facts. Greg was not Zoe's biological father, but her stepfather. Zoe's mother had lost custody of her months ago in a bitter court battle, and Zoe's biological father had been awarded full custody. Greg, in cahoots with Zoe's mother, had hatched a plan to kidnap Zoe and flee the country, as evidenced by documents found in his possession. Zoe's father, overcome with emotion, continued to hold her close. His relief at having her back was palpable. He turned to Michael, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I can't even begin to thank you. You saved my little girl. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Michael, ever humble, replied, "There's no need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do in that situation. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves, especially children." But Zoe's father was insistent. "I have to do something. At least let me invite you to a barbecue at our place this weekend. You're like family now, and I need to tell you more about what led to all this," he urged. Michael, initially hesitant, eventually agreed. He was also curious to learn more about the events that had transpired. As the night wore on, Michael gave a formal statement to the police, detailing every aspect of his encounter at the rest stop. Zoe, too, was interviewed by a child specialist with her father by her side for support. Her testimony corroborated Michael's account, further solidifying the case against Greg. A few days later, Michael arrived at Zoe's father's house for the barbecue. The backyard was filled with the sounds of laughter and the smell of grilled food. Zoe was playing with other children, her laughter a stark contrast to the terrified girl Michael had first met. "It's great to see her like this," Michael remarked as he stood next to Zoe's father, watching the children. Zoe's father nodded, his expression turning serious. "You know, I never thought something like this would happen. The custody battle was so ugly. Her mother made threats, but I never imagined she'd go this far," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what could have been. He then explained how Greg and Zoe's mother had planned everything meticulously, waiting for the right moment to take Zoe. As they talked, Michael realized just how close Zoe had come to being taken away forever. His decision to trust his instincts had truly changed the course of her life. The barbecue continued, and Michael found himself feeling more and more at home. He interacted with Zoe's family and friends, and the initial awkwardness of being a stranger faded away. Before leaving, Michael said his goodbyes to Zoe and her father. Zoe ran up to him and gave him a hug. "Thank you for saving me," she said, her eyes shining. Michael smiled and ruffled her hair. "You're welcome, Zoe. You be good," he replied. As Michael drove away, he reflected on the events of the past few days. From a simple stop at a rest stop to becoming involved in a life-changing situation, it had been an unexpected journey. But it had also been a powerful reminder of the importance of trusting one's instincts and the difference one person can make. He knew that he would always be connected to Zoe and her family in some way, and he was grateful for the experience. This encounter had not only saved a young girl, but also brought a new sense of purpose and connection to his own life.
If this story touched you, show your support by liking and subscribing. Your encouragement helps us keep sharing memorable stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.